Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of our witnesses this morning. Thank you to each of you for joining us today for our first hearing of the Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance in the 119th Congress. I welcome all of our subcommittee members, as Chairman said, that will also be arriving, and I truly hope that we can find common ground this Congress as we work to combat crime and make our communities safer. Most Americans probably think that we've never met a victim of human trafficking or online exploitation, that these crimes happen everywhere else. But the unfortunate reality is that more than 36 million reports of online child sexual exploitation were made in 2023, while reports of online enticement increased more than 300% in just 2 years. And human trafficking, a multi-billion-dollar industry that includes both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, has been reported in all 50 states. Before I became a member of Congress, believe it or not, I was a flight attendant. And I was trained to spot the signs of trafficking on board the airline, the planes. We were taught that if we saw someone in distress, we would reach out and help that person find safety if we could. This training continues today through the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign, which educates people in key industries and the public to help identify victims of trafficking. But what happens after that victim is discovered, whether by a flight attendant, a doctor, a hotel manager, a friend, or a member of the community, what happens after that? Almost 25 years ago, Congress recognized that to combat human trafficking effectively, a system was needed that could help victims escape, get the support that they needed, and if they were willing, aid law enforcement in prosecuting their trafficker. With the help of trafficking advocates, Congress's solution was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, a bipartisan bill that invested in prevention, protection of victims, and prosecutions. But today, the entire system is in jeopardy. The current administration's chaotic and reckless approach to governing has put lives on the line by freezing funding and stopping the very critical work done by organizations that help victims and help survivors. These disruptions have already forced nonprofits to lay off employees. And while some organizations have had their funding restored, they still worry about how this administration might continue to undermine their work. If the president continues down this path and funding is cut for good, it will be trafficking victims and survivors who pay the price. Without shelters, where will these victims and survivors go? Without lawyers or social workers, who will advocate for them to make sure that they get the services that they need? Without assurances of safety, how will victims work with law enforcement in pursuing charges that might prevent a trafficker from reaching new victims? If this administration lets the system fail, victims will have nowhere to turn. And that is exactly what traffickers want. When victims feel like they have nowhere to go, traffickers can promise them safety, then turn on them to resume their exploitation. Now, I'm sure that there may be some out there who still think that this issue doesn't affect them. But the reality is that human trafficking and online exploitation, both in the United States and abroad, it harms all Americans. When the administration attempted to illegally dismantle USAID and froze State Department funding, U.S. anti-trafficking efforts were stopped around the world, efforts that protect Americans and the United States' interests. For example, USAID has been working to combat online operations in South Asia known as scam farms, which use forced labor to scam Americans. Democrats and Republicans have long been able to work together to combat human trafficking and online exploitation. At this moment, and I believe this is possible, but at this moment, we need our Republican colleagues to stand with us in calling on the administration to stop the chaos and stop the disruptions. Join us in protecting these very vital programs and organizations and their funding so that we can truly protect the victims and survivors of these reprehensible crimes. Now is not the time for us to cut off funding for law enforcement and safety reforms and safety efforts. Funding is absolutely necessary to combat these egregious crimes. And I yield back.